I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Patrick Walsh. Patrick is an Associate Professor of 18th Century Irish History at Trinity College Dublin. He is with Dr. Kieran O'Neill, one of the co-directors of the Trinity Colonial Legacies project. So would you please join me in welcoming Patrick to the floor to give his talk, Cultivating Virtue, Trinity College Dublin and its Colonial Legacies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Charles, and for the invitation to be here tonight, and to all of you for coming. What I want to do is, I want to talk about the history of one of Dublin's great institutions, at least great in terms of big, we can reserve judgment otherwise, Trinity College Dublin and its colonial legacies. This, as we'll see, is a history that's bound up with the city, and indeed with the city corporation, and its descendant institution, the City Council, who are sponsoring our talk tonight. Trinity was established by a royal charter in 1592 at the urging of members of the city's patrician, merchant and ecclesiastical classes. So the rich, the clerical and the learned. And the university was intended as a colonial institution with the mission of cultivating virtue. And that phrase, which I've used in my title, appears in the university's founding charter in 1592. And I'm going to come back to it a little bit through my talk. And we can think about for whom virtue was cultivated, how much virtue was cultivated, and how that virtue is still cultivated or not as we go through. But it speaks, I suppose, to the mission of the university at its founding point. And Trinity has myriad, I suppose, legacies and historical legacies. And my time tonight is necessarily limited. What I want to do is think about some of the key elements in this story, and that will leave us some time for questions and discussions, points of interjection afterwards. So you should see a slide here of the structure of my talk. So I want to think a little bit about why legacies and why interrogate institutional legacies. I want to think about the colonial origins of Trinity. I want to think about then three key and within that, to think about three key sort of thematics. So I want to think about Trinity as a colonial landowner in Ireland. I want to think about slavery and its legacies. And I want to think about collecting. And collecting involves many things and people, for that matter. So I want to think about Trinity's collections and their legacies. And within that, throughout, I want to draw sort of linkages between the university and the wider city and some of the wider colonial legacies in the city, because Trinity is both an island in the centre of the city, the local residents, many of whom in the local community on Pearse Street and elsewhere around Trinity, many of whose sort of family members worked in Trinity and still work in Trinity, intergenerationally used to refer to it as Little Britain. Well, the official name of the college is Trinity College near Dublin, which points to its sort of adjunct island sort of status. I once tried to convince a fellow student that it was modelled on the Kremlin. It's not, but it is that sort of walled institution in the sort of centre of the city. But it's also very much part of the city, and to understand its history is also to shed light on the wider history of the city. So I want to come back to that a bit. So just to say something about the origins of our project, where we're at, where it came from. In 2021, when we began, and this project is not I'm one of the co-directors of the project. I work with my colleague, Professor Kieran O'Neill, and we had a wonderful postdoc, Dr. Mobeen Hussain, for 2 years. Then she moved to York. We lost her, and her sort of inspirational sort of driving us to think harder all the time, which was really, really helpful. You need to work with people who make you rethink your own assumptions and push you and force you. And she was brilliant at that. And we've had a series of other people and interns and students working with us on various short-term minor projects. And we've continued to do that because it's a collaborative project. So that's important. And when we began, we were very aware that our work was part of a bigger national, but also an international story. Universities, other major public institutions across the world were beginning to address the legacies of slavery, of colonization, of colonialism, of racial privilege embedded in their physical and mental environments. Student activism in South Africa which I often see as a kind of starting point, had led to the removal of an enormous statue. And nearer home in Glasgow, we're reshaping our understanding of the importance of the profits from slavery in supporting the foundation and mission of elite universities. Major public-facing research projects drew attention to the huge sums of money invested in universities on the back of unfree labour, while the forgotten presence of enslaved labour at American campuses came back into the public memory of the university, though I suspect it's again disappearing. The descendants of the slaves had, of course, not forgotten. And this speaks to the institutional privilege that allows difficult pasts to be erased or forgotten. This growing public awareness of the legacies of slavery, of the colonial and racial ideologies that produced it, came into greater focus in 2020 with the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement in the aftermath of the brutal police killing of George Floyd in the US. We all remember this. The racial prejudice and indifference that had contributed to his murder brought out an unprecedented global response, which led to further reassessments of the legacies of slavery and historical racial science in our contemporary society. Words like decolonisation, reparations, restitution entered our public conversations. So too did more pejorative terms like woke, though it too had originated as a black activist slogan, though it's very much been repurposed, I think, as a pejorative, dismissive word. The cynical amongst you might wonder how much this newfound desire of many institutions to explore their colonial pasts was about reputation management and the global turn away from diversity initiatives in the last year certainly perhaps adds some value to this critique. I think that's perhaps a little too reductive, but we should always be wary of institutional motives and why institutions start to rethink and repackage their own past. I'm very conscious of this in thinking about one of the other great Dublin institutions, which of course has been repackaged for us this week in Guinness's. But in Ireland, this global moment coincided with a revived interest in probing our complex historical relationship with empire. Ireland was both a colonised country and a coloniser. Signs of our colonial past, once rendered invisible, became more visible as researchers started to draw attention to Irish connections with not just anti-slavery and abolition, but also slavery and to the role of many Irish men and indeed women in European colonial projects, alongside the more well-known and celebrated histories of colonial solidarities. In Trinity, some of our students began to call for a revision of the curriculum, something that was very much an ongoing process, but which began with the inauguration of a Black Studies programme led by a wonderful sociologist, Phil Mullen. Students also became aware of the very public memorialisation of the enslaver, George Berkeley, on our campus's main library, pictured here when it opens in the 1960s as the New Library in 1967, and raised pertinent questions about where this stood with the university's values in contemporary pluralistic Ireland. These questions, together with long-standing concerns about the content of the university's medical and museum collections, provided the impetus for our project. We've been fully supported by the university, our advisory board, chaired by our Chancellor, the formidable and inspiring Mary McAleese, who's been a great friend to our project, to poke around in Trinity's murkier corners and to continuously present our research in public. And I think doing this history in public is really important, and collaboratively with community partners. It's an essential guiding principle in terms of thinking about how one engages with difficult and complex pasts. And this is something that I think we often get asked about, is how do you do this work? And I think, why do you do it? And for me, I think one of the critical things is doing it with people, engaging with communities, engaging with people who are interested in something, having conversations. And that way, they can change my mind, I can change their mind. We can come together to think about ways of addressing things that can make us uncomfortable, or things that allow our past to become less complex, or to become sometimes become more complex, but to allow our past to be rethunk for 21st century Ireland. And I think that's really important. Now, beginning in 2021, our project is now in its fourth year. It was a 2-year project. That's academia for you. The Trinity Colonial Legacies project has from its beginning been interested in thinking about Trinity's colonial legacies in a really broad view, focusing on either slavery or historic museum collections alone, as many institutions have done, would not be enough. It would not do justice to the story we feel we need to tell. Likewise, to write and think about Trinity's colonial history while ignoring its legacies in Irish society would miss half the picture. In our remaining time, I want therefore to think through some of the major issues that we've been thinking about and continue to think about. And I'm going to take you on a tour that takes in places as diverse as Ballinascreenagh in North Kerry, Bermuda and Inishbofin, as well as the city around us, or I could just say swords, skulls and seaweed. Our slaves, skulls and seaweed. But I want to start with Trinity's origins as a university. That was like its Scottish near contemporary Edinburgh, which was founded in 1584, so 8 years before Trinity, both one of the last of the medieval and the first of the modern universities. So that is sort of hinge point. In both Edinburgh and Dublin, the impetus for the university came from the urban elites, from the merchants, from the aldermen of the city. In Dublin, merchant families like the Balls, the Challoners and the Ushers saw how a university would bring glory to Dublin, potentially economic growth. Together with Archbishop Adam Loftus, the first provost, these godly yet worldly merchants envisaged the university as a crucial civilising and reforming element in Reformation Dublin. They petitioned Queen Elizabeth accordingly, and Dublin got its university after almost 30 years of trying to get this project off the ground in 1592. And the city corporation kept up their end of the bargain. They donated the previously confiscated estate of All Hallows Abbey, somewhat on swampland, at what was then the far edge of the city, it's hard to imagine, as the site near Dublin of the university campus. This link with the city governors would be maintained through the long history of the college. When Trinity celebrated its tercentenary or 300th birthday in 1892 with enormous pomp, and this was truly an enormous event, and ceremony, the Lord Mayor of Dublin led the grand parade that celebrated this through the city. So very much a sort of symbiotic relationship there. Trinity's educational structure, its governance, as well as some of its jargon, owed much to Oxford and especially Cambridge, from where much of its early, very Puritan fellows came from. But it was also very much a colonial university. Here it fitted into two worlds: the old medieval universities across the water, or at least near water, and the frontier universities of the American colonies, founded to spread Reformation and Anglicisation. And you can see here Trinity and some of its contemporaries, Harvard and Yale at the top, and Harvard and Trinity down the bottom there. And this could be seen in the early curriculum, in its commitment to elite formation, to the training of clergy to preach the Protestant Reformation, and even in the very early short-lived commitment to training preachers in the Irish language as a means of conversion. This mission, as laid out in its charter, was to cultivate virtue and to transform Irish society. Well, that's all fine. How are you going to pay for it? And when we think about universities, and we hear about universities today, we often hear about money. How are we going to pay for a university? What is the source of finance? And this is the essential local colonial context. Trinity's greatest funding source from the 1590s through to the 1920s was its huge, and I mean huge, Irish estates. They totalled over 195,000 acres. That's 1.25% of the Irish landmass. It's the equivalent to County Louth. These vast estates were largely the product of war, particularly the 9 Years' War. The Battle of Kinsale, this painting you see here, hangs in the old library in Trinity, was donated in the 1780s almost as a memento of the founding moment of the college. And the Battle of Kinsale serves as a sort of motif through the 17th century as the great deliverance moment, the great victory over the Gaelic Irish. In the 1590s, Elizabeth I gave the college grants of so-called concealed lands in Kerry. As part of the Munster Plantation, the college employed agents, described by Provost John Mahaffey in the early 20th century as unscrupulous men, to discover, and that word discover is always used, lands that had been confiscated during the plantation to vest them in the college's possession. These lands, together with further grants in counties Donegal, Fermanagh and Antrim, as part of the Ulster plantation, by 1610 encompassed 178,000 acres, and eventually this rises to nearly 200,000 acres by the mid-18th century, with a further 30,000 acres, much of them in County Galway, as a separate estate for the provost's own revenue. So the provost had her own estate, or his own estate at that time, and paying their salary. And we can see this map just very loosely gives some sense of them. This was produced by the Irish Independent at the very outset of our project, and I still use it because we haven't got a better one yet. But you can get some of the key sort of figures here. These colonial grants transformed the university's revenues and prospects. They would become its dominant source of funds until Irish independence and the 1923 Land Act. They also transformed the Irish landscape and the lives of the people living on them. The legacies of this transformation can be seen in the land today. They're present in place names, like the County Armagh townland of Fellows Hall, pictured here in this wonderful image from a 1775 survey of the Trinity Estates, complete with imagined houses. And I don't know how the landscape looked quite this verdant. Otherwise, Crearum or Aught and Willen, and College Hall, formerly Macara Atty or Marasit in the same county. There's a College Lands GAA club in the same vicinity. I think most people there don't know who that is named after. Well, the County Kerry village of Moyvan was known for over a century as Newtown Sands in honour of the college's local agents, the descendants of the 17th century colonial settler Colonel Lancelot Sands. A local vote in 1939 removed the name and restored the ancient Irish name. And these place names literally record the rewriting of the landscape in the coloniser's language. Less immediately visible are the more subtle shifts in the landscape made by the processes of legal imperialism and agrarian capitalism. But even in such survey maps like this, the point of this survey in 1775 is to describe the land, to show its value and its agricultural value. It comes from a wonderful atlas by a guy called Richard Frizzell, and this is around Valentia Island in South Kerry and the town of Carrasavine, which was essentially a Trinity town and developed by Trinity in the 19th century and run by the provost's son-in-law, a Punjab army veteran from the 1860s to the 1890s. He lived in what's now the Met Éireann House in Valentia and sort of built a hotel, the Trinity Arms, built a butter market, sat as a magistrate, set up a sailing club, collected rent and harassed people for rent in Valentia Island and Carrasavine and the Evora Peninsula. And there are still colonial remnants of some of this. There's a pier on part of this estate which still belongs to Trinity. It turned up in a Dáil question last week where the minister said, well, that's Trinity's, I can't do anything about that. You have to get them to fix your pier. And the college went, well, not us. So you can put these estate surveys map out the value of the estate and they point to the sort of value. I think that's probably important. And the property was sort of described and valued and commercialised with, woods were cut down, privatised, changing inherited customary practices. Labouring families were moved from the richer soils, sometimes to because they were more suitable for cattle rearing, and they were moved to boggier and rougher ground on the margins. And this becomes very clear when you read the descriptions, and you can see that all the cabins are in the mudland or in the uplands. You can see this in County Donegal, you can see this in Kerry, we can see this even in richer, more prosperous County Armagh. And I came to understand this history much more clearly myself, both by reading the records in the college muniments or archives, and by discovering that within the stories of the many thousands of Irish people who lived on Trinity land in 1843, according to this extraordinary survey by a man called Maurice Collis, and this is just one tiny page of it. It's 14 volumes. He describes every townland, every house, the occupation of the people living in there. He doesn't give their names, but gives everything else. And he counts all the people. There were 71,000 people living on Trinity land in 1843 on the eve of the Great Famine. So that's just under 1% of the Irish population. Well, I discovered during the summer, having done a lot of this work, was that some of them were my own ancestors. So this adds a new story. So my grandmother, Braddy Horgan, who's pictured here with my grandfather, Michael Walsh, was born on a Trinity estate in the North Kerry townland of Ballymascrina. And this was marginal land. It's the not pretty part of Kerry. Hard to believe, and I say that as a second-generation Kerryman. Described by the college surveyors as improvable in the 18th century and as visibly overcrowded in the 19th century, the Horgans and their neighbours' experience in North Kerry was mirrored by the college tenants in Donegal, Fermanagh, and even in more prosperous Armagh. And the population of their townland, and much of the townlands in County Kerry, which there are 66,000 acres, fell by nearly 20% during the Great Famine. This is more than all the other neighbouring estates. So Trinity's record during the Great Famine is not great. It's not good at all. They donate £2,000 to famine relief out of a total rental income of £25,000 per annum, which they assiduously collect during these years. And again, I think that's important. Indeed, the most visible legacy of the Trinity estates in the mid-19th century obscures this history. It's the architectural marvel that is Dean and Woodward's extraordinary and wonderful museum building, built in 1852 and built to house some of the colonial collections I'm going to talk about later, and funded primarily by college estate revenues, and built in the 1850s, within 5 years of the Great Famine. The colonial origins of this extraordinary building are ignored, but the college does, in other ways, in its daily rituals, remember the colonial grants that made it possible. Every evening during term time, fellows and scholars sit down for dinner, or can sit down for dinner. If we all turned up, this would cause chaos, in the dining hall. Before doing so, they listen to a Latin grace, usually rattled off by a scholar. And this grace, after meat as it's called, it was composed by Provost William Bedell in 1626 or 27, specifically thanks the benefactions of Queen Elizabeth, the founder of this college. You can see that, I'm not going to pronounce the Latin, James I and Charles I, i.e. the colonial land grants made as part of the plantations. The college gave up these estates, albeit extremely reluctantly, in 1923. They tried to get a clause into the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1922 to protect these estates, but Lloyd George, as was his wont, promised one thing and did another. There's quite a lot of that in the treaty. And as part of but in 1923, as part of the last of the Irish Land Acts, last big one, which revolutionised Irish land ownership in the early 20th century, these lands, most of which reverted back to the people living on them, or reverted to the people living on them. But the college's daily rituals still remember 100 years later and acknowledge these grants, but not the tenants who worked the land and laboured, as one tenant told the Folklore Commission, to feed the parsons. And today, we're trying to redress the erasure of the Trinity tenants to acknowledge their labour and their forgotten history. The Trinity Board this summer has agreed that a public memorial should be erected in a prominent position on campus to remember the tenants, while we're also actively seeking to digitise some of the many records, to bring these stories back to the communities from whence they came. In doing so, we're of course opening up a wider conversation about the colonial history of Irish land ownership, about the colonial hierarchies of power and money that shaped so much of our built heritage in this city and elsewhere. Some of these hierarchies are remembered and acknowledged, as with much else in Dublin, through wit. And again, I think of Trinity as being referred to as Little Britain, as a subtle othering from the workers of their employer. And if you want to read more about this, I've just published a short piece on this in the Dublin Review of Books last week, called TCD's Forgotten Tenantry. I've been obsessed about it recently. And Trinity's colonial legacies, of course, extend beyond our island and connect Trinity and Dublin to colonial spaces across the globe. The controversial story of George Berkeley, Trinity's greatest philosopher, connects the Trinity story across Atlantic currents to Bermuda and Rhode Island. This too is a story about cultivating virtue and improving the natives. Berkeley's history as an enslaver and his legacies provided the impetus for our project, but they also connected to the wider international conversation about the legacies of enslavement. Berkeley is remembered today as one of 18th century Ireland's most significant and original thinkers, whether on the philosophy of materialism, which I don't profess to understand, or an Irish political economy, which I have a better sense of. Particularly a famous book called The Queerist, which is a series of 336 questions with no answers. It's a classic just asking questions sort of book. These intellectual achievements and his role in the building of the old library, he was the librarian who sponsored that project, led to his memorialisation in Trinity in the 2 centuries after his death in the 1750s. Gold medals, funded by the bishop himself, were awarded to the best performers in ancient Greek. We can see them here. Up until very recently, when both the money ran out and we stopped teaching ancient Greek, which conveniently. While a stained glass window was erected in his honour in the chapel in the mid-19th century. In 1978, Trinity's new library, built in 1967, was named after him. But Berkeley was also, or Berkeley, an avowed imperialist and a defender and practitioner of enslavement. In the 1720s, frustrated by what he saw as the moral decay of Britain and Ireland, and seeking utopia, he developed a scheme for a university called St. Paul's. This is possibly because he was rejected for the curacy of the parish of St. Paul's in Dublin, allegedly. He'd never been to Bermuda, but he believed it was just the sort of place where he could establish a university away from the corruption of the modern world. He published a prospectus outlining his plans. You can see the full title here. It's a lengthy title. And it's a remarkable pamphlet. It's also an extraordinarily problematic document. Berkeley's great plan was not only to educate colonial elites in America, but also to educate indigenous Americans who could then be used to convert their own communities. So far, so good. Recognizing, however, that they may not be so keen on coming to his university, he advocated kidnapping indigenous youths, or as he terms them, savage Americans, and educating them. This project for a university was Berkeley's own personal proposal, but it also implicated Trinity as an institution. All of the founding fellows, and they're listed here in the postscript of his new university, were to be drawn from the fellows of Trinity, and the educational model drew very much on the Trinity sort of model. He also advocated preaching the Christian gospel to the enslaved population as a means of control, arguing that baptizing enslaved people would make them more malleable. Here he was venturing into a contested contemporary debate about whether the enslaved should be baptized. And this marks him out as an ideological supporter of slavery. But he also had the opportunity to become an enslaver. In 1728, while waiting for a government grant for his college, he sailed from Newport in Rhode Island, where he intended to settle before moving to Bermuda. Upon arrival in Newport, which is one of the premier enslavement ports in the American colonies, he acquired an estate called Whitehall. He also purchased labour for the estate, purchasing at least 4 enslaved people: Philip, Paul, Edward, and Agnes, later baptized as Philip, Paul, Edward, and Agnes Berkeley. And we can see the baptismal records here on this slide from Trinity Church, no connection to the university in Newport. And we can see here, I think these are the really striking documents. These are the deeds of purchase of a Negro named Philip, aged 14 years or thereabouts, for £80 in October 1730. And we have Edward, aged about £20 for £76. The older you got, the cheaper you became. And these deeds, they look like house deeds. So anybody who's ever seen a mortgage deed or the deed to your house, or if you ever buy a house, if you ever get to buy a house, the same sort of terminology, that to have and to hold, is there. It's repeated in every deed in the Registry of Deeds down in Henrietta Street. And these deeds are sitting in the Berkeley papers in the British Museum and the British Library, and kind of show directly the sort of purchase of people. And they're really, I think, quite affecting documents. So he was both an enslaver who purchased slaves. He was also an intellectual defender of slavery, a position he continued to hold after his return to Ireland. And we can see in his Irish writings in the mid-1730s onwards that he's using the American example and the American slavery example to think about the political economy of Ireland and how to think about the poorer people in his neighbourhood of Cloyne in County Cork, and the ways to make them work better and be better and more dutiful peasants. And he'd returned to Ireland because his college project failed. It did, however, have a significant legacy in American higher education. He donated his books to Harvard and to Yale. He donated his plantation to Yale. You still own it. It's now on a 300-year lease to somebody else, and the house is owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution, one of these sort of heritage organisations that reflect back to sort of ancestor and descendants of American revolutionaries, with no mention of Berkeley or his slaves within their publicity. And in Yale, they used the revenue from this estate to build residential buildings for students, to sponsor prizes in his name. The first recipient of one of the gold medals was a man called Elijah Wheelock, who went on to found Dartmouth, who practiced Berkeley's policy of kidnapping Indigenous American students for Dartmouth. So again, that story sort of continues, and that sort of legacy. One of the other recipients of these medals was Aaron Burr of Hamilton fame. So if you know Hamilton, you know Aaron Burr. Meanwhile, in the 19th century, supporters for a new university in California took inspiration from the bishop's writings and named their new institution after him. Today, we associate UC Berkeley with the 1960s counterculture and liberalism, but its origins lie in the colonial assumptions of Berkeley's Bermuda Project. And California in the 1850s was very much a utopian space where you could imagine new worlds. In some ways, that sort of has always been California's raison d'etre. And in Dublin, we named a library after him, and the reasoning for doing so drew on his name recognition and associations with America. And this is very clear when we look at the college minutes from the board in terms of naming the libraries from 1977. They name it, I suggest George Berkeley be used in place of Archbishop Usher, and because of his relationship with America has increased his fame. And they'd used Berkeley's name and his American connections in the publicity materials for building Corraleck's magnificent library in the 1960s. And as late as 2013, the Trinity Provost was using Berkeley's name in Harvard, saying, well, we have this connection. So this it's been used as a sort of monetized. The IDA were trying to sell investment into East Cork in the 1980s on the back of that American graduates recognized Berkeley's name. So again, he has this sort of transatlantic sort of long afterlife. His purchase deeds had been, as we've seen, were clearly visible in his papers, but his 20th century biographers largely relegated them to a footnote. Modern scholarship, including in philosophy, recognises now more problematic Berkeley. It was on these grounds that Trinity considered his legacy anew from 2021 onwards, leading to the denaming of the library in 2023. The idea of denaming, while practiced in an American context, was unknown in Ireland, but it became the preferred option of a newly formed committee, a very collaborative committee at the university, the Trinity Legacy Review Working Group, that's a mouthful, following an extended public consultation. And this consultation, which brought in over 110 submissions from members of the public, allowed that decision to be made and to be thought about and was informed by it. It was a hugely productive process and really quite striking reading many of the testimonials that came in on either side of that debate. And it brought in people from within and without the university to engage with the decision-making process. And denaming was decoupled from renaming to give it space to think about what should happen next. And a separate public process led to the renaming of the library after the poet Ivan Boland. And again, this involved in, and this is just where the submissions came in on the university website, this involved an extensive public consultation as well as vigorous internal debate. The decision to name the library after Ivan Boland was a landmark moment, not least because it was the first time a building on Trinity's campus was named after a woman. It was also one of the very few so named in the city, where with the grand exception of Countess Markovich, there's been a preference, if we're going to name anything after a woman, to name them after mythical women. Molly Malone and Olivia spring immediately to mind. The Ivan Boland Library is not just an important part of Trinity's monumental landscape, but also of Dublin's. It also better reflects the values of the university today, and this is, after all, the purpose of commemoration, to reflect not just our understanding of the past, but how it relates to our present. And you can see here that renaming ceremony earlier this year, and there were over 800 public submissions, and they ranged from Library McLibrary face to more serious suggestions. There's quite starting, and they're all available. There's a wonderful exhibition in the foyer of the library, which is publicly open, and where one can go and have a look at them. The Berkeley Library story also, I think, revealed with greater clarity the connections between Ireland and indeed Dublin with transatlantic slavery. Our own research has drawn out other Trinity-related stories which illustrate in microcosm some of the bigger themes of Ireland's relationship with slavery. There were students in Trinity who grew up on slave plantations In the Caribbean and North America, there were graduates who went back or acquired slave plantations. One Trinity professor of botany, William Alman, for instance, was born on a plantation in Jamaica, while two sons of a professor of history, one of my direct intellectual, I suppose, ancestors, and sometime vice provost, Francis Hodgkinson, a terrible man in many ways, was amongst the circa 300 Irish men and women compensated for the loss of their property, i.e. enslaved people, on the abolition of slavery in 1833. There were other connections too, perhaps more substantive ones. Trinity's celebrated front gate on College Green was paid for by a parliamentary grant from the Irish Parliament. This grant, like an earlier one, granted to build many of the buildings that we see in Trinity's front square from the red brick rubrics onwards, was secured on taxes which were charged specifically on imports of colonial slave-produced tobacco and sugar. So tobacco taxes, the more people that smoked, the more revenue was generated, the more buildings came. So who says smoking doesn't pay? Irish consumers' tastes for enslaved produced goods thus shaped the built heritage of the university and the city. And there were other aspects to this story we can think about. Outside Front Arch, we find this statue here, Edmund Burke, perhaps an even more celebrated graduate of Trinity than George Berkeley. Like the bishop, Burke has a complex intellectual relationship with slavery. While personally morally appalled at the idea of slavery, he was also MP for Bristol, one of the largest slave trading ports in these islands, and he was a lobbyist for the local West Indies interest, so otherwise they wouldn't vote for him. His brother and his cousin were key figures in the colonial sort of apparatus in Jamaica and elsewhere in the Caribbean, and we can see a sort of personal implication there. But in Parliament, when abolition of slavery came up, Burke, always a cautious man, advised the Secretary of State, Dundas, that you need to be careful here. These people aren't ready for freedom, and came up with a compromise solution, which became known as gradualism. So from the late 1780s, everybody knew that slavery would be abolished, but not just yet. So when you look at the figures of people trafficked across the Atlantic, British ships, there's an enormous spike in the 1790s, because the slave traders know their business is coming to an end. And Burke is one of the key intellectual sort of proponents of this idea of gradualism. So, and again, this speaks to another ways. When we think about slavery, we tend to think about people who own slaves, but enslavers, about the ancillary industries, about the sugar bakers in Dublin, about the beef merchants in Cork, financing and supplying Irish cattle being barrelled up and sent out to Barbados or wherever. But we also need to think about the government policymakers, about the politicians who are enabling and constructing this system. So in the same way that we think about Berkeley as a critical ideological supporter for the baptism of slaves and the idea of Christianizing them, we can think of Burke as a key figure in thinking about and in postponing abolition because these people aren't ready. And again, this brings to mind Burke's most famous contributions to our intellectual culture and his kind of horrified responses to the French Revolution, which led to an honorary degree from Trinity in the 1790s. But we can also think about other aspects of Dublin's connections to slavery, and it's worth just highlighting some of these. We can think about the sugar bakers, people like Joseph Wilson, who's commemorated by a window in the Unitarian Church, but the Bewley family and their complicated relationship with slavery, but Dublin's bankers, the Latouche family. The Latouche is so important because this allows me to cast shade on our rival university out in Belfield, because Belfield, in UCD, the name Belfield is the name of the Latouche family plantation in Jamaica. They just translated the name back to Dublin, as is the other two estates that make up the UCD campus. You have Belfield, you have Richview, you have Roebuck. All of those you'll find on the map of Jamaica. And again, I think that points to the legacies of slavery. And one could go on. There's other sort of hidden and less hidden slaveries. But there is also, of course, a tradition of anti-slavery. We need to think about people like Daniel O'Connell. And my personal favourite of the anti-slavery tradition in Dublin is a woman called Mary Burkett, who as a 17-year-old, she was a Quaker, produced a long and terrible poem advocating for consumer boycotts, which somehow got published. And I think it's really important. I always share it with my students, because it shows that teenage poetry sometimes has a purpose. However, so slavery, really important, and I think tells us something about university and their complex legacies. And the Berkeley Library project has been a major component of our project. it's probably the most publicly best known. But I want to just talk briefly about collections, because this brings us to two of the other great sort of elements of this story we need to think about. Museums and collections are an integral part of the university, and we can think about all the many collections that we find in today's universities. There's a reason why Trinity is Dublin's leading tourist attraction. It's because of the collections in the old library. There's a famous Scottish book. Let's not talk about that. But there are many other collections: botany collections, zoology collections, geology collections. And there's been a museum of sorts in Trinity for a very long time. The Trinity Museum was founded in the 1770s. It used to be in Regent House above front gate. It was open to the public as well as to the members of the university. This is the only image we have of it from 1819. You can see a stuffed giraffe in the middle. We think we've identified the origins of that giraffe in the papers. You can find it being shipped. And there's a whole range of cabinets of curiosities here. And the founding collection was a large collection of Captain Cook-related objects that had been collected on Cook's voyages to Australia and Hawaii, and then brought back to Dublin by two medical doctors who, in exchange for honorary degrees, handed collections over to Trinity. So a huge collection. And so it's a public-facing collection of curiosities. There are also fascinating global collections in the Zoology Museum, in the geological collections, in the botany collections. They're all really important. But I want to concentrate on the human remains and ethnographic collections, because I think these are the ones that are really most striking. So, leaving the animals aside for the moment, we go back to people. Trinity has a long and distinguished medical history and a very old medical faculty going back to the early 18th century. The medical faculty, however, has sometimes done things that perhaps they're less proud of today. This is the anthropometric lab. And you can see reams of skeletons and human skulls in the cabinets in the background here, and various measuring devices. And it's part of a sort of racial science in the 1880s and 1890s that was all about measuring skull size. So scientists like to measure people's heads and therefore judge their intelligence. The base sort of normal person was usually taken from a sample of students. Trinity students seemed less enthusiastic about this than students at Cambridge, where they would then put these against their results and then they try to tally up. If you got a 2-2, what size was your head and how does that work? This is obviously nonsense, but a lot of people believe this is really serious science. So you get these skull rooms, as they're known, in a whole range of universities. Perhaps the most impressive one, if one wants to use that word, is in Edinburgh. But Trinity has a vast human remains collection in its old anatomy school. And it's a global collection. There's maybe 500 remains. We don't really know because the catalogue's not very good and it's very difficult to work out the provenance of all of them. But this map here, this gives some sense of the global origins of them. You can see everywhere from Nigeria to Burma to Australia to South and North America and beyond, and tells us something. The records that survive they're partial, but they're extraordinary. They tell us something about the taking of these remains, how they were, where they came from. So there's a collection of about 18 sets of remains from Rangoon jail in Burma. There are remains taken then with a little note saying, I was disturbed when taking this, so there's a big shovel mark on it, and then posted back in a kind of trunk back to the professor of anatomy from his students around the world. We can only imagine what receiving that post was like. So we have this sort of huge collection, but this collection also flips back to an Irish setting. Because these same scientists that are interested in collecting this international collection are also interested in thinking about the Irish population and putting the Irish population in their sort of in academic conversation with indigenous peoples elsewhere in the world. So the key scientist is a man called Alfred Haddon, a fellow called Haddon and a fellow called Dixon. And Haddon had done a lot of work in the Torres Straits of Australia. He also does a lot of work in the west of Ireland. And here we see islanders in the island of Inishbofin in 1893 off the west coast of Galway having their heads measured and recorded as pure examples of the Irish Gael. You can see the RIC men standing in the background. This is on Inishbofin Pier. It's an extraordinary image. And there's a wonderful collection of these photographs in the Trinity collections and available publicly online. But in Inishbofin, they didn't just measure people. they also collected human remains. And they took them, and there was no other way to describe this, we can see the proof in a moment, from this church here, St. Colman's churchyard, where there was a collection of skulls stuck in behind the altarpiece. And they were taken by two scientists, Dixon and Haddon. And their own description is here. I won't read it all, but you can get a sense of it. The we two climbed over the gate, went down the enclosure, disturbing some cattle, stumbled along, entered the church. In the corner, we saw the skulls in a recess. And they take them. Then the coast was clear. We put our spoils in the sack, cautiously made our way back to the road. It didn't matter who saw us. Sailors wanted us to take the sack. We got back to the boat, but Dixon would not give us them. And asked what it was, he said, "Ochine." So without any further trouble, we got the skulls aboard, we packed them in his trunk, locked it, and only we knew there were a dozen skulls on board. They shan't know either. So that's in Haddon's diary. So again, we can see the furtive, slightly boy's own adventure narrative that's going on here. It's really quite remarkable. These skulls went and sat in the anatomy collection from the 1890s through until 2023. And it was only about 10 years ago the islanders became aware that these skulls were still in Trinity. They had some folkloric knowledge that they'd been taken, and they started to petition the university to get them back. And after a very long process, the skulls were eventually returned to Inishbofin 2 summers ago. This again involved a public consultation. I think the most striking piece in that public consultation is this enormous petition. 165 people signed the petition, 160 giving an Inishbofin address out of 175 people on the island. And there's a wider submission of descendants of the island. So it's the first time that human remains like this that have been taken from an Irish community have been returned rather than repatriated, because we're in the same jurisdiction, to an Irish community. And it's a really remarkable sort of moment, and involved a remarkably difficult process, because the islanders were understandably very impatient, going, well, why do you need to worry about paperwork? This needs to happen now. And I always remember when the islanders come into a meeting and just almost spitting at us, process, process, process. I've heard enough, process. And we just want them back. And after long negotiations, they were returned. This is the provost, Linda Doyle, with Tommy Burke, one of the island representatives. We can see the hearse here in Front Square. They were then taken to Inishbofin on a lovely summer's day, buried in a traditional island coffin, which we can see here, specially constructed. And in the old churchyard, we can see here the grave marker, and here lie remains of our ancestors, including 13 skulls, removed without permission in 1890, held in Trinity College for 133 years, returned for burial. A really striking sort of moment. And these aren't the only examples of this. There are other collections from Finian's Bay in South Kerry, which are going to be returned next spring. The paperwork is currently going through all the many different government agencies you have to deal with to do this. And there were other remains that were stolen from the Aran Islands and other places, which may yet find a conclusion. So, human remains, hugely important collection. The other collection I just want to highlight is the ethnographic collections. These were collections, again, global collections of weapons, of trophies, of tribal goods from Nigeria, from Burma, from Australia, from Hawaii. And we can see here, this is an 1890s image of spears on display on the staircase just inside the front arch in Trinity. Most of these objects, about 11,000 items, nobody's quite sure, because we can't quite work them out, because the provenance hasn't been done, and it's hard to distinguish which ones are Trinity objects. Some because the other major founding collections of the National Museum, its foundation in the 19th century, came from the Royal Irish Academy next door, and the RDS, which my colleague Rachel, who's down there, is working on at the moment. But these 11,000 items, they're in the National Museum. They haven't been on display since the 1970s. And the museum, and here we have some of our students. I think there are some friends of some of our students from 2 years ago in this picture. But again, we can see some of the objects here. And the museum, like other museums, is reckoning with these collections, trying to understand them and trying to just learn a lot more about where they come from. So again, it's a huge project, and it's an ongoing project. The National Museum has only had an ethnographic curator for 3 years. And it's a vast collection in a huge room. You go in and there's those spears everywhere. And a lot of them still have tips of poison on them from the 19th century, so you have to be careful. But it's remarkable, and it's a collection that we hope more will be done with. So just to finish up, I just want to, I suppose, just think a little bit about, just to broaden back out. So when we think about Trinity, we can think about colonial legacies, about collections, about connections to slavery, about connections to the colonial relationships that underpin our own society. But it also allows us to maybe broaden out, just to think about the colonial legacies that are around us every day when we walk around the city. So we think about our monumental landscape. Who and what is represented? And I've given as a representative example here Traitor's Gate, Fusiliers Arch at St. Stephen's Green, but we could pick out so many more. We can think about the streets. Who are they named after? What do those names tell us? What stories are hidden, sometimes in really plain view? The Earl of Chatham, great imperialist, the mid-18th century. Pitt the Elder, off Grafton Street, for example. Ainger Street. Focus here of a great Dublin City Council publication. But Ainger Street, the money to develop Ainger Street came from a guy called Ainger. First name I'm blanking on. And there's Francis Ainger and his brother, his brother who I'm trying to think of, who was governor of Bombay. And he was a major figure in the early East India Company. So the money comes back from the East India Company, flows back into the family coffers. They developed one of the first major urban estates in Dublin, Dublin's oldest house, surviving houses on Ainger Street. Gerald Ainger, that's him. So again, a sort of hidden sort of story there. And you can think of, there are so many more around the city that allowed us to think about some of the, we can think of more banal legacies of empire. We can think about Bewley's Oriental Cafe, the complications of Bewley's as promoting East Indian sugar as non-slave produced sugar rather than Indian sugar. So taking a stand on not producing slave produced sugar. But the Bewley family legacy is a more complex story and brilliantly put on display in an Abbey Theatre production last year called Blood Sugar, which really drew this out really well. It's a very veiled very slightly veiled account of the Bewley family and their complicated relationships with abolition. We also might think about Dublin's church interiors. We can think of the Unitarian Church on Stephen's Green, generally seen as a site of doing good and a wonderfully progressive and enlightened community in the city in all sorts of ways. But we also have this major stained glass window, which is funded by Dublin's biggest sugar merchant and enslaver, Joseph Wilson. So again, just the complications there. And if one really wants to go and see colonial legacies in Dublin, there is no better place than St. Patrick's Cathedral. And one can go and one can stand in the South Transept and see all the war memorials of the small wars of the 19th century, as they were called. They're only small to some people. They're never small to the people that are there. And I think it's a hugely important site in terms of thinking about these memories. And the Church of Ireland, I think, has enormous colonial legacies, which it needs to, I think, probably interrogate even further. So that's just, I suppose, as a way of just thinking outwards. And I think it's important to think about the legacies that are out there and what these stories, and think about ways we can open up conversations and collaborative conversations, because that's how you make progress, and that's how you get to really think out these stories and the forgotten people. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.